There's a version of Elon Musk the world knows well. The rockets, the factories, the relentless headlines, the man who seems to move faster than the rest of us can keep up with. But long before any of that, he was simply a young engineering student in Canada, and the woman who would spend 9 years married to him was a writer named Justine Wilson. Their story is not just a story about a divorce. It's a story about what happens when two very different definitions of love collide, and about the single moment Justine has said made her finally understand that her marriage was already over, long before anyone told her so. This is the real story of Justine and Elon Musk, told through what has actually been documented, reported, and, most importantly, written by Justine herself. Justine Wilson met Elon Musk in the early 1990s at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Both were students, both were serious about ideas, and both were, in their own ways, restless. Justine has described Elon in that era as intensely driven even then, a young man who spoke about the future in terms of what he intended to build, not what he hoped might happen to him. He was not, by most accounts, a smooth or effortless romantic figure. He was awkward, direct, and almost stubbornly persistent, and that persistence became one of the defining features of how their relationship began. They dated on and off through their university years, drifted apart when their paths took them to different cities and different lives, and reconnected later as adults, by which point Elon was already deep into building his first companies in Silicon Valley. Justine, meanwhile, was pursuing her own path as a writer, chasing the kind of creative career that takes patience, discipline, and a very different rhythm of life than the one she would eventually find herself living. When they married in January 2000, Elon had just sold his company Zip2 and was pouring his resulting wealth and energy into what would become X.com, the company that eventually evolved into PayPal. It was, on paper, the beginning of an extraordinary life. Justine has since described those early years with a kind of clear-eyed honesty, not painting them as a fairy tale, but as the start of a partnership between two ambitious people who loved each other and who had very different ideas about what a marriage was supposed to look like day to day. In 2002, Elon and Justine welcomed their first child, a son named Nevada Alexander Musk. What followed was one of the most devastating events either of them would ever live through. At 10 weeks old, Nevada died of sudden infant death syndrome. It is, by any measure, one of the cruelest losses a parent can experience, and it arrived in a marriage that was still finding its footing. Justine has spoken and written publicly about how differently she and Elon processed that grief. Where she needed to talk, to sit with the loss, to let herself fall apart in order to eventually put herself back together, Elon moved in the opposite direction, toward motion, toward work, toward the next problem that could be solved. This is not a detail invented for drama. It is something Justine herself identified, in her own words, as one of the earliest fractures in how they related to each other. Two people can love each other deeply and still grieve in ways that pull them apart instead of together, and that appears to be exactly what happened here. Rather than allow the loss to define them, the couple chose to try again. Using IVF, they went on to have twin sons, Griffin and Xavier, born in 2004, followed by triplets, Damien, Saxon, and Kai, born in 2006. In the span of a few years, Justine went from grieving the loss of her first child to raising 5 young boys, all while her husband's companies, Tesla and SpaceX among them, were entering some of the most volatile and demanding periods of their existence. By the mid-2000s, Elon Musk's professional life had become an all-consuming force. Tesla was fighting for survival. SpaceX was absorbing enormous amounts of capital and attention with no guarantee of success. The public version of Elon Musk, the tireless founder who slept at the office and treated failure as simply another data point, was taking shape in these years, and it took shape inside a household that Justine was, in large part, running alone. In interviews and in her own writing after the marriage ended, Justine described feeling a growing distance that had less to do with any single argument and more to do with the accumulated weight of imbalance. She has spoken about feeling like her identity as a writer and as an individual was being slowly absorbed into the role of supporting a much larger, much louder ambition. This is a familiar dynamic to many people who have loved someone consumed by an outsized professional drive. The sense that you have become infrastructure in someone else's project rather than a partner in a shared life. It's worth being honest here about what is documented and what is not. Justine has never claimed, in her own public writing, that Elon was cruel for its own sake, or that he set out to diminish her. What she has described is something quieter and, in some ways, more relatable. A mismatch in emotional needs, a husband who expressed care through problem-solving and provision rather than presence, and a wife who needed connection in a form he struggled to offer. Whether that constitutes a villain and a victim, or simply two incompatible people who tried hard and ultimately couldn't make it work, is something reasonable people can disagree about, and something Justine herself has approached with more nuance over the years than any single dramatic narrative can capture. One detail that has been widely reported, and which Justine has referenced publicly, involved a legal agreement signed before their marriage. According to reporting on the divorce proceedings, the couple had entered into a post-nuptial agreement, a legal document affecting how assets would be handled were the marriage to end. When the marriage did eventually end, this agreement became a central and contentious part of the legal battle that followed, with Justine's legal team arguing it should not stand and Elon's team arguing it should. Court records from the time describe a dispute over whether the agreement was fair, given the enormous growth in Elon's net worth between the time it was signed and the time the divorce was filed. Ultimately, courts largely upheld the agreement, and the case highlighted how differently a marriage can look from the outside compared to how it feels to the person living inside its legal architecture. This wasn't just a romantic unraveling. It was, for Justine, also a very real financial and legal fight, unfolding at the same time as the emotional one. By early 2008, the marriage had reached a breaking point. The details of exactly what led to the final decision are, understandably, private. Neither Elon nor Justine has laid out a single dramatic scene as the definitive end. What is documented is this. In 2008, after years of accumulated strain, Elon filed for divorce. It came, by Justine's own account, with a suddenness that left her reeling. Not because the underlying problems were new to her, but because the finality of it arrived faster than she was prepared for. Not long after the divorce was filed, Elon became involved with actress Tallulah Riley, whom he had met in London, and the two would go on to marry not long after his divorce from Justine was finalized. For Justine, learning of this new relationship while still processing the end of her 9-year marriage was, by her own description, one of the most painful parts of an already painful period. The sense that a new chapter of his life had already begun while she was still trying to understand the last one. The divorce itself became a lengthy and public legal process, playing out over roughly 2 years. It touched on custody arrangements for their 5 sons, financial settlements shaped heavily by that earlier post-nuptial agreement, and a strange experience of having deeply personal matters discussed in courtrooms and, eventually, in the press. In 2010, Justine did something that few people in her position choose to do. She wrote about her experience, in her own words, in an essay published by Marie Claire. That essay remains the single most important primary source for understanding her side of the marriage, because it is not secondhand reporting or speculation. It is Justine's own account of what she went through. In broad terms, without quoting her essay directly, Justine described the imbalance of power that developed in the marriage as Elon's wealth and fame grew. The loneliness of grieving Nevada in a way that felt unsupported, and the emotional distance that widened over the years despite the family growing larger. She wrote with striking honesty about losing touch with her own identity, and about the particular difficulty of separating from someone whose life was so thoroughly documented and discussed by the public. The essay was not, by most readings, an act of revenge. It read instead as an attempt to reclaim a narrative that had, until then, been told almost entirely through the lens of Elon's success. For a woman who had spent years managing a household, raising 5 children, and grieving a devastating loss largely out of public view, putting her own experience in her own words was, in itself a kind of turning point. In the years that followed, Justine has spoken about the process of rebuilding her identity outside of the marriage. She returned to writing fiction, publishing novels that draw on themes of resilience, identity, and the emotional complexity of women navigating loss and reinvention. Themes that, unsurprisingly, echo elements of her own life. Her writing career, which had been set aside during the years of raising young children and managing an increasingly demanding household, became central to her life again. She has also spoken publicly and with notable generosity about her relationship with her 5 sons and her approach to co-parenting after the divorce. Rather than positioning herself in opposition to Elon in front of their children, she has described prioritizing stability and honesty for them, even while being candid in her own writing about the difficulties of the marriage itself. That distinction, being honest about her own experience while still protecting her children's relationship with their father, is one of the more striking aspects of how she has handled the years since the divorce. Justine Musk's story, told accurately, is not a simple tale of villain and victim. It is the story of 2 people who met young, built a life together through genuine hardship, including the kind of loss most parents never have to face, and ultimately discovered that the things that drew them together were not enough to keep them aligned as their lives grew larger and more complicated. It is a story about ambition and its costs, about grief processed in incompatible ways, and about a woman who, after years of being defined in relation to someone else, chose to tell her own story in her own words. What stands out most, looking at the documented record, is not a single dramatic sentence or a single cinematic scene. It's the slow accumulation of years. A marriage that began with real connection, was tested by real tragedy, strained under real imbalance, and ended in a way that left both people changed. Justine Musk's decision to speak publicly about that experience, rather than remain silent, is arguably the most consequential moment in the entire story. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. What do you think was the real turning point in their story? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more real, well-researched stories.